Hi guys, welcome back to Honest Straightforward Reviews. Today I'm super excited to bring to you guys a greatly requested review of the PNY RTX 4080. Now this is the one without all the fancy RGB lighting on it, and it's got the normal clocking. The boost clock on this is 2545 megahertz. Now if you don't know much about the 40 series cards, they are built on the Ada Lovelace architecture and have the 3rd gen ray tracing cores with 4th gen tensor cores. Also, it's featuring the new custom TSMC 4nm process with a larger L2 cache, which means it's using a lot less power to deliver the performance. Now this is a beautiful little card. If you want a black card that has 3 spinning fans, one of the fans in the middle goes the opposite way. The fans are the same size. The card, what you need to be mindful of, is called a 3-slot card, so it'll use 3 of the pins in your computer's back to hold itself, but it is a lot bigger than a 3-slot card. Okay, it's thicker. However, having said that, this is one of the smallest cards that you can buy on the market if you are cramped for space in your case. I put this in my Lian Li Mesh 2 case, and there was plenty of room in there for everything else, all the fans. I've got a radiator for the CPU in there as well, with double fans on both sides of the radiator, and it fit in just fine. Now I won't harp on too much about this. You can have a look at my full review of the 40 series cards against the AMD card, and you can judge it by yourself what the differences are. Let's get into the review. Let's get into all the charts. So the first chart I have for you guys are the GPU clock and specs. So straight off the mark, I have got 3 GPUs to go up against this GPU. So I've got the 4080 Founders Edition, the 4090 Founders Edition, and the 3090 Ti Founders Edition against this card. We'll be mostly comparing this against the Founders Edition 4080. These 2 cards are identical in every sense. Both their core and boost clocks are exactly the same. Everything else is the same because it's the same sort of card. Next slide I have for you guys is the memory clock and specs. Now here we see again basically exactly the same between the 4080 and the 4080 by PNY. Okay, the next slide I have for you guys is a more of a slide that'll show you a bit more difference. So it is fan noise relative to temperature. So the first 2 slots I have is for when the system is idling. So when it's idling, the PNY card is a slight bit hotter, runs a slight bit hotter, only 2 degrees, with the fan completely stopped. Now the next I have is gaming. So looking at gaming, the GPU temperature is at about 65 degrees, which is again 2 degrees hotter than the Founders Edition, and the hotspot, the GPU hotspot, is about 3 degrees hotter at 76 degrees. Looking at VRAM, the VRAM, to my surprise, was a bit cooler by about 5 degrees at 63 degrees, and the sound is quite good as well at 39 decibels. The RPMs, it was running at a bit of a higher RPM, hence the noise as well, so 1449. Now the next slide I have for you guys is the comparison of power consumption. The first test I have for you is between the 2 cards at idle, and it is just a 1 watt difference, which is not much. Looking when you have 2 monitors plugged in, there's a 2 watt difference. When you're playing videos, that jumps to 3 watt difference. Again, all of this is the PNY is using more power than the Founders Edition. When you go on to gaming, you have a 14 watt difference. When you go to ray tracing on, again, you still see a 10 watt difference, and at absolute max power that I saw them chugging out was at about 12 watt difference. And when you have VSync on with 60 Hz, it uses about 8 watts more. The transient spikes for both the cards were exactly the same, to my surprise, at 371. Now let's get into some benchmarks. The first benchmark I have for you guys is for Blender, testing the computer render performance in Classroom, Junkshop, and Monster. Here we see quite disappointingly that the Founders Edition beats it in all aspects. Not by much, by only a tiny amount, but it is better. Next slide I have for you guys is Unigine Heaven benchmark. In Unigine Heaven we see that the Founders Edition 4080 scores 388 frames while the PNY is at 371. At this higher frame rate, that is an improvement, but not by much, especially considering that whomever buys these cards are going to be buying it to game at least 2K to 4K. And at that, it won't be this significant. Next benchmark I have for you is Unigine 2 Superposition, and this has been run in DirectX 11. We see that the difference is about 2 frames between the cards. The Founders Edition wins this test again. The next test is 3D Time Spy benchmark, and this is in DirectX 12. And looking at this, we see again the 4080 improves the overall score of the system. So this is the exact same system. You have Windows 11, all the specs are down there, so you've got the exact CPU, then everything is exactly the same except for the score is a tiny bit improved. However, when we look at the graphical score, we see that the 4080 Founders Edition is quite a bit ahead against the PNY. Next test I have for you guys is 3D Firestrike Ultra in DirectX 11, and we see here that the Founders Edition is again ahead. I have a slide with 3D Mark Port Royale Hybrid Ray Tracing benchmark, and here we see the difference between them is negligible, a margin of error 1 frame difference between these two cards. The next slide I have for you guys is 3D Mark Full Path Ray Tracing in DirectX, and here we see there's a 3 frame, quite a substantial difference between these two cards that are meant to be the same, and the Founders Edition is 3 frames ahead of the 4080. Let's get into some gaming benchmarks. The first gaming benchmark that I have for you guys is Callisto Protocol, the Callisto Protocol in 2K with ray tracing turned off. First I'll go through 20 games with ray tracing turned off, then I'll have a further 10 games at ray tracing turned on. Looking at the average between these two, they're exactly identical when you're gaming at 2K, except for the 1% low, which is a margin of error 1 frame difference between the two. Going on to 4K, we see that the Founders Edition is 2 frames ahead and the 1% lows are exactly the same. Next game I have for you guys is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and at 2K we see that the Founders Edition card is about 4 frames ahead at 219 and about 1 frame improvement in 1% lows. Looking at 4K, we see a 2 frame improvement in the Founders Edition while a 1 frame improvement in the 1% low. Next game I have for you guys is Cyberpunk 2077, where we see hardly any difference. They're basically identical other than counting for our margin of error differences. When we move on to 4K, we see the same story with a 1 frame improvement in the 1% low for the 4080 PNY. The next game I have is Formula 1 2022 Singapore in wet conditions, and we don't see any differences between these two cards. Moving on to 4K, it's the exact same story except for the 1% low, the PNY struggles with 2 frames behind. Moving on to Hitman, we see a similar story. However, we see that there's an improvement in the 4080 by PNY in the 1% low of 4 frames, which is quite impressive. Moving on to 4K, we see that the Founders Edition card is doing quite well with 2% increase in the average frames and a 3 frame increase in the 1% low. Next game I have for you guys is Halo Infinite. Founders Edition does both better in 1% lows and the average frames are increased by 3 frames. When we get to 4K, they're basically identical. Next game I have for you guys is Hunt Showdown, and here we see there is a 5 frame difference and a 6 frame difference in the 1% low, where the Founders Edition is leading. When we go to 4K, we see basically margin of error differences between these two cards. The next game I have for you guys is Far Cry 6. At 2K, we see a 3 frame increase for the Founders Edition and also a 2 frame improvement in the 1% low. In 4K, we see a 2 frame increase for the Founders Edition and basically same identical 1% lows. Next game I have for you guys is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and here we see a 3 frame difference in the average, where the Founders Edition is leading by 3 frames, and in the 1% low we see a 2 frame increase for the Founders Edition. Edition. Going on to 4K, they're basically identical and just a 1 frame difference between the card, which can be attributed to margin of error. The next game I have for you guys is Dying Light 2 Stay Human, and at 2K we have the Founders Edition leading by 2 frames both in the average and the 1% lows. Going on to 4K, we see an identical score. Next game I have for you guys is Horizon Zero Dawn with DirectX 12, and here we see that the Founders Edition card is really doing well with about 6 frame average and with a 3 frame improvement in the 1% low. Going on to 4K, we see the 1% low being identical, however a 2 frame improvement for the Founders Edition card. Next game I have for you guys is Forza Horizon 5, and we see an identical score except for the 1% low being 2 frames lower for the PNY card. Going on to 4K, again we see margin of error 1 frame here and there, otherwise identical scores. Next game I have is Watchdog Legions. Here we see the Founders Edition again pulling up at 3 frames ahead of the PNY card and 2 frames ahead in the 1% low. At 4K, we have a 2 frame improvement, while a 1 frame improvement in the 1% lows for the Founders Edition 4080. Next game I have is Rainbow Six Extraction, and this has been tested in Vulkan, and at 2K we see a 8 frame improvement for the Founders Edition, while the 1% low, the 4080 leads in there just by 1%. Looking at 4K, we see the same story continue, where the Founders Edition is leading by 3 frames at 158, and again the PNY has a 1% advantage in margin of error territory and 1% low. Next game I have for you guys is Resident Evil 3 Remake in DirectX 12, and 2K we have an improvement of 8 frames, and in the 1% low we have an improvement of 4 frames, which is quite good for the Founders Edition card. Moving on to 4K, we see that the Founders Edition card is still pulling up ahead of the PNY by about 4 frames in the average, and the 1% lows are about the same. Next game I have for you guys is The Outer Worlds, and at 2K we have a 9 frame increase for the Founders Edition with a 2 frame increase in the 1% lows, which is quite good. When we go on to 4K, we see this margin reduced, but still the Founders Edition card is ahead by 2 frames in the average FPS. Next game I have for you guys is Total War Warhammer 3. At 2K, both the cards are exactly the same, except for the 1% margin of error at 52 for the PNY, 53 for the Founders Edition, 1% low. When we go on to 4K, we see basically identical scores of 68 and 67 for the PNY, just being behind 1 frame. Looking at Control DirectX 12, at 2K we see a 1 frame difference in the average. At 156, Founders Edition is leading by, but no differences in the 1% low whatsoever. When we go on to the 4K testing, we see that there is a 3 frame improvement for the Founders Edition, with the 1% lows remain the exact same. Next game I have for you guys is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. With Shadow of the Tomb Raider, you see a 8 frame increase for the Founders Edition, while a 2 frame improvement for the 1% lows. Looking at Shadow of the Tomb Raider in 4K, we see that they're basically identical in the average, where there's a 1 frame difference in the average. However, when we go on to the 1% low, we see a 2 frame improvement for the Founders Edition. Last game I have for you guys, as usual, is The Witcher 3. In 2K, you will have an improvement of 3 frames for The Witcher with a 1% low of 2 frames again. So the Founders Edition card leads in 2 frames both in the average and 1% low. Looking on to 4K, we see a 3 frame difference in the average for the Founders Edition card, and the same score for both the 1% low for both cards. Let's move on to our 4K and 2K RT turned on testing. Looking at 4K, we see the cards are basically 1 frame difference between them, which is margin of error, but when we go on to 2K, we see that improved by 3 frames for the Founders Edition. So the Founders Edition is doing quite well in these tests. Next game I have for you guys is Cyberpunk 2077, where we have an identical score of 29 average for 4K 4K, and when we go to 2K, it's 1 frame. Next test I have for you guys is control. Looking at 4K, we have the exact same score for both the cards at 45 average, and when we go on to 2K, we have a 2 frame difference at 92 improvement for the Founders Edition, while the PNY card is at 90 frame. Next test I have for you guys is Far Cry 6. At 4K, we have a 1 frame difference, while when we go on to 2K, there's a 2 frame difference. When we go on to Resident Evil Village, we see a 2 frame improvement for the Founders Edition card with ray tracing turned on, while at 4K we see a 2 frame improvement, while a 3 frame improvement for the 2K results. Next I have is Formula 1 2022 with ray tracing turned on. At 4K we have an identical score, while at 2K we have a 2 frame improvement for the Founders Edition 4080. Next game I have for you guys is Watch Dogs Legions. In 4K we have an identical basically score of 1% margin of error at 59 and 58, while when we go on to 2K it's the same with 103 and 102 for the PNY. Next game I have for you guys is Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. Looking at 4K, we have a 1 frame difference for the Founders Edition being at 85, and 2 frame improvement for the Founders Edition at 152 when we go to 2K. Last 2 games I have for you guys is with the 1% lows. As you can appreciate, it takes a lot of time and effort to test these out. Being a one-man show, having family, having my own job to fund all this doesn't leave me with a lot of time, hence these cards are so late. I had this PNY card back in February and 2023, and now is the time that I finally was able to compile all my tests together, do the dubbing, do the editing, and get it out to you guys. So if you appreciate that, do remember to like, subscribe, and watch more videos to fund me, and you can also super thanks, which will help out a lot. Now, looking at Resident Evil 3 Remake with DirectX 12 RT turned on at 2K, we see a 9 frame improvement for the Founders Edition and a 3 frame improvement in the 1% lows. Going on to 4K, we see a 2 frame difference in the average for the Founders Edition, and there's no difference in the 1% low. The next game and the last game I have for you guys is Hitman 3 with DirectX 12. For 2K, we have a 2 frame average difference where the Founders Edition comes up ahead, whereas there's no difference in the 1% low. When we go on to 4K, we see that these cards are absolutely identical in their result. That concludes our testing. Let's get off to our average. The first average I have for you guys is between the 20 games with RT turned off for 2K. We see there is about a 3.5 frame difference, which is very respectable for the Founders Edition. The Founders Edition comes up ahead, averages by 3 frames ahead of the PNY card. When we go on to the 1% lows, there's hardly anything in it at 139.55 for the Founders Edition, while the PNY card is at 138.25. When we put these cards up against the greatest card from the last generation, which is Ampere technology, the 3090 Ti Founders Edition, we see there's quite a bit of improvement, given that the 4080 is not their flagship and it's not their Ti. It's a massive improvement between them of about 34 frames average. When we look at the Founders Edition 4090, we see a class leading 205 frames, nearly 206 frames average. We then move on to 4K, average of 20 games with RT turned off. We see that there is not much when we go to 4K between these two cards. The 1% low is barely there with a 0.45 difference, whereas when we look at the average, there's about 1.5 frames in the average, there's the difference. But when you look at the 4090 Founders Edition, that's a massive leap ahead at 145.45 frames. Let's look at best value for money GPU between these, considering RT is turned off. The most expensive would be the 3090 Ti Founders Edition. They're still really expensive to buy. Even in the second-hand market. Looking at the PNY 4080 and the Founders Edition 4080, if you could find the Founders Edition 4080, you would be better off, because not only does it perform better, but it costs just about the same as the PNY 4080. You can't get it in Australia, but overseas, if you can get your hands on it, it's a better card, as you'll be saving quite a bit in both 4K and 2K gaming. Let's go on to the real test, where we test RT turned on. We have the 2K and the 4K average between the 10 games. We see that at 4K, there's not even a 1 frame improvement for the Founders Edition. They're basically about the same, but the Founders Edition overall is a tiny bit improved. When we go on to 2K, there's nearly a 3 frame improvement for the Founders Edition, which is quite disappointing to see on the PNY being a add-in board partner. I will talk about this and address it in the end, but let's look at the Founders Edition 4090 and the Founders Edition 3090 Ti. The difference is massive in 4K. There's nearly a 40 frame increase, and when we look at 2K, there's a 50 frame increase, which is a massive jump. The last absolute slide I have for you guys is the best performing GPU based on cost per frame. Looking at these two cards at 4K, the 4080 PNY is a tiny bit more expensive, and at 2K it's again a tiny bit more expensive. It's not really worth buying based on these values. Let's get to my conclusion. The PNY is a very small card, can fit in everywhere, and it's quite cheap. The things that I don't like about it is the fan noise is quite high, even compared with the Founders Edition. When I compared it with other GPUs, it was quite high, especially the add-in board partners. For example, if you look at the Aorus Master 4080, that has a cooler of the 4090. So the GPU runs a lot cooler compared to this GPU, and hence it doesn't need to ramp up as high. When it doesn't ramp its fans up as high, it leads to a more quieter GPU, a cooler GPU, and a GPU that can push itself a bit further. Now, the PNY that I do have, that has a very good silicon in it, and it can be pushed up quite high. However, it is disappointing to see the fans aren't that good on this card, and they're quite noisy. So those are the factors that I have, and what Nvidia has done in this generation, especially for the 4090, 4080 and 4070 Ti, they have not only a very good silicon in their hand, but for the first time they have got a very, very good cooler on top as well, with really good fans that are quiet and keep the GPU really cool. Hence it's making life so hard for the AIBs, because they are competing against a card that GPU is already being pushed to its furthest limit with a cooler that's very good. So in previous generations, the GPU wasn't pushed as hard, neither was the cooler as good, but the cooler is really good on this generation. It's got really good thermals. It's really, really well built. So me personally, if you want the cheapest 4080 PNY, you're not fussed about the sound, and you want it just to fit in your system, it's quite small, I would consider this card, but personally I would stay away from it as it's quite a noisy card. Thank you for watching it to the end. Remember to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments below what you thought about this review, and what you liked or disliked about it, and what else you would like to see in this review. If you appreciate this review, remember there's always the super thanks button. Thank you for watching it to the end. Take good care. Bye bye.